In the first video, the Book of Saint Cyprian destroyed an entire family. But that was just one of his victims. What you're about to see is what happens when someone tries to use the book, and the book responds. An alchemist summoned it. A convent tried to seal it. And when all else failed, there was one last hope. Throw him into the depths of the ocean. If you haven't seen the first chapter, do so now. There you'll learn the origin of the grimoire, its first curse, and how it ended up hidden in a doomed mansion. The link is in the description. But if you're already here, get ready, because this video will show you what happened when a man opened the book, when the friars tried to confront him, and when they threw him into the sea forever. Horace Vane and the Dark Ritual of 1910. In the history of the Saint Cyprian grimoire, there are names that recur like a warning echo. An alchemist, a mystic, a brilliant man, and completely lost in his obsession. Europe was beginning to transform. Science, reason, progress. In 1909, Vane obtained a map. According to him, it came from a private collection in Prague. The map marked a crypt in the Carpathian mountains, where monks were rumored to have sealed a forbidden object that sang in the darkness. He didn't hesitate. Along with 7 followers, he set out on an expedition toward what would today be the border between Romania and Ukraine. It took weeks to arrive. The convent was in ruins, covered in fog, partially swallowed by vegetation. But as they descended the stone steps leading to the crypt, the air changed. The whispers began before they even opened the door. Inside, they found it, floating a few inches off the floor. Over the next few days, Vane prepared a ritual. According to his notes, the grimoire contained a fragment of a spell to open the door of the soul, an invocation that, if completed correctly, would allow direct connection with what he called the primordial consciousness. He chose the night of the new moon. The ritual took place in the center of the crypt. 7 black candles were lit. The candles burst. The walls began to bleed a dark liquid. From a wound, shadows emerged. They had no form, but their presence was felt. They didn't move. They slithered. They whispered names. Names none of them knew, but which felt like their own. Vane's followers began to scream. One tore out his eyes. Another threw himself against the wall until his skull exploded. Vane remained silent, hypnotized, consumed by something only he saw. The grimoire floated in front of him, its pages turned by themselves. The next morning, the crypt was empty. Only ashes remained, charred symbols on the floor, and the grimoire box, open. A local shepherd found Vane a week later. He walked alone, barefoot, covered in mud and dried blood. He didn't speak. He only murmured, "I saw it. I heard it. I'm not me anymore." Horace Vane disappeared shortly after. Some claim he was admitted to a sanatorium in Vienna. Others, that he committed suicide by throwing himself into a frozen lake. And still others say he's still alive because the ritual worked and he was granted what he sought, but at the price of never being human again. The grimoire disappeared again. It left behind a trail of death, madness, and the certainty that not all knowledge is meant to be discovered. The Carpathian exorcism, the last hope. After Horace Vane's failed ritual, the grimoire disappeared again. But the consequences didn't. The mountains remembered, and something remained unsaid. The earth trembled silently. The animals abandoned the forests, and the sky above a certain monastery hidden in the Carpathian mountains no longer seemed to look at the world with the same eyes. The monastery of St. Peter ad Gloriam was an ancient structure founded by hermits in the 11th century. Hidden in perpetual fog and along inaccessible paths, it served as a spiritual refuge for a secret order of exorcist friars, quietly authorized by the Holy See. These men didn't say Mass. They didn't preach. When news of Vane's ritual reached the Vatican, the order knew the grimoire had returned, and it was time to act. Several months after the incident with Vane, an anonymous traveler left a sealed box at the entrance to the monastery. His face was not seen. He didn't say a word. The friars opened the box in the main chapel. Inside was the grimoire, cold, damp, as if it had just emerged from a swamp or another plane. One of the friars, upon touching it, fell to his knees and began to convulse. For minutes, he repeated a single name, Asmodai, 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 and then lost consciousness for 3 days. The friars knew this wasn't just a cursed reading. The book had been activated, and now something was following him. For weeks, the entire order dedicated itself to preparing the most complex exorcism ritual in its history, fasting. In silence, they wrote psalms on ancient parchments. They drew containment circles with powdered gold, consecrated blood, and black salt. They used chants in Aramaic, Greek, and an ancient dialect that, according to their records, had only been used once before in a failed exorcism in Jerusalem in 133. The night of the ritual, the sky was motionless. No wind, no clouds, no stars. The monastery chapel was sealed. Only 5 friars entered, 5 men prepared to die if necessary. The grimoire was placed on a stone table in the center of the ritual circle, and the exorcism began, but there was no response, not at first, until a candle burst, then another, and then the air grew dense, as if a gigantic presence had sat on the convent roof, a pressure that crushed the soul. The pages of the book began to move on their own. The ground shook. One of the friars fell dead instantly. Another began to speak in forgotten tongues as he writhed on the ground. But the others didn't give in. They continued the ritual. They shouted psalms as the ground bled. The grimoire trembled as if something inside it was trying to escape. Then the containment circle glowed with an impossible light. The void roared, and the book snapped shut. The entity vanished. The air became breathable again. The candles went out. They had won, but at a terrible cost. 3 friars died. 1 was left in a vegetative state. Only the group's leader, Friar Abel, survived with his consciousness intact. A grimoire was locked in a lead box, sealed with ancient crucifixes, prayers engraved in Latin, and locks that only respond to consecrated voices. It was hidden in the deepest catacombs of the monastery, and access deliberately forgotten. The order was dissolved soon after. Its members disappeared, and the convent was abandoned. But the book was never destroyed. The final attempt, the incinerator of 1952. It all began when the grimoire reappeared without explanation on an ancient stone altar in a ruined church in the Romanian city of Sighișoara, in the heart of Transylvania. It was there, as if someone or something had placed it there on purpose. The priests knew what it meant, and they knew they couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. A small team was assembled. 3 priests experienced in exorcisms, 2 mediums specializing in residual energy, and a former Benedictine monk who had come into contact with the book decades earlier. The mission: take the grimoire to the local industrial incinerator, a furnace capable of reaching temperatures of over 1400 degrees Celsius, more than enough to turn any object into ash. But they weren't sure if it would be enough to destroy this. A lead box was wrapped in a sacred cloth consecrated with holy water from the Holy Land. It was then secured with wrought iron chains, each link individually blessed. As they drove on in an armored vehicle borrowed from the army, the sky began to darken. Even though it was high noon, the driver lost the radio signal. They arrived at the incinerator just as night fell. They lit the boilers. They prepared the fire. They recited the prayers, and as the furnace opened, the box began to vibrate, not from the heat, but as if something inside had awakened, sensing danger. The head priest, Father Mikhail, cautiously reached out. He opened the box. The book was there, closed, but dripping black liquid, as if weeping dark ink. Just before they threw it into the fire, all the lights began to flicker. The floor shook, and the metal objects in the room began to vibrate. Suddenly, a voice came from the speakers, still disconnected. I was not written to die. The chains broke on their own. The doors slammed shut. A freezing blast swept through the room, extinguishing the flames of the furnace. And then the whispers began. Not in the air, inside each person's mind. One of the priests began to bleed from his eyes. Another fell to his knees, babbling in a forgotten language. Father Mikhail, holding a burning crucifix, shouted, "Vade retro, maledictum scriptum," to the flames in the name of God. But before he could throw the grimoire, everything stopped. Total darkness. No sound, no air. Seconds passed, minutes, no one knows. And when they woke up, the furnace was still on, but the book was out. The box was locked, the chains were broken, and the grimoire was intact. Not a burn, not a crack, as if the fire had avoided touching it. The team didn't try again. The trauma was too profound. One of the mediums was hospitalized forever. The other disappeared weeks later, leaving only a single sentence in his diary. What's in that book? Doesn't want to die, because it still has things to do. The descent into the sea. The knight in the grimoire was cast into the abyss. After the failed attempt to destroy the grimoire in the incinerator, Father Mikhail realized what generations of exorcists, alchemists, and occultists had already known. The Book of Saint Cyprian cannot be eliminated. It can only be set aside, where no one will ever find it. With the Vatican's silent approval, Mikhail made a desperate decision: to throw the grimoire into the depths of the Black Sea. Unlike fire or arcane seals, the sea was a prison without walls, a cold, silent, unexplored pit where even demons lose their echo. But the sea also holds things, and what enters its waters doesn't always remain dormant. For this mission, Father Mikhail turned to an old friend, Anatoly Gregorova, a retired merchant ship captain, war veteran, and expert on forbidden routes. Gregorova wasn't superstitious until he saw the box. A black lead structure, covered in chains, wrapped in Christian symbols, and sealed with blessed wax. Upon touching it, his compass deviated 3 times without being moved. He accepted the mission without question, but he never slept the same again. It was a moonless night. A storm was brewing, but they waited for that exact moment. The grimoire was to be cast when the sea was at its most violent, when the energy of the earth itself could help stem its tide. They sailed out to sea for more than 5 hours, without lights, without a fixed course, guided only by the instructions Mikhail had written by hand, based on ancient maps, forgotten stars, and an apocryphal text from the 15th century. At midnight, something changed. The wind stopped, the waves flattened, the sky, starless. An unnatural calm fell over the ship. They prepared the crate, they reinforced the chains, they attached additional weight to ensure it sank to the deepest bed. And then, without words, they released it. The water greeted her with a dry sound, impossible to describe, like a sigh, like a cry stifled for centuries. The chains sank quickly. The box disappeared in a matter of seconds. And then, a bubble. Just one, solitary, perfect, floating to the surface. As if the grimoire were exhaling, Gregorova hurriedly started the engine. They didn't say a word on the way back. For weeks, Captain Gregorova refused to talk about the voyage. He had nightmares. He heard knocking in the ship's hold, even though it was sailing empty. Finally, he wrote a letter. The only time he mentioned that night. I'll never forget the silence. It wasn't peace. It was surveillance, as if something was watching us from below. Mikhail handed his diary over to the Holy See shortly after he left the order. He spent the rest of his life in retreat in a small hermitage without mirrors or clocks. He never spoke the name of the book again. For decades, it was believed the grimoire had been contained. The legends began to fade. The archives were closed, and the name of Saint Cyprian returned to its martyr persona, hiding the sorcerer who wrote it. But it wasn't the end, just a respite, because the book didn't disappear. It just waited. If you liked it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. In the next video, I'll tell you how. 70 years later, a team of scientists found the sealed box at the bottom of the Black Sea, and when they opened it,